My name is Lila Merrick, 30 years old. The day my father-in-law tried to buy my absence, the city looked freshly polished after rain, steel and glass pretending to be clean. His office sat high enough that taxis looked like patient insects inching along Park Avenue. The desk between us was a slab of mahogany larger than my first apartment, and his voice, when it came, was the kind that had gotten used to shaping other people's futures. "Sit," he said, without looking up. I didn't. He finally raised his head the way a man checks a receipt, verifying expense against benefit. On the walls behind him, generations of Ashworth men stared out in matching suits and chilly eyes. If you lined up their portraits, you could chart the rise of Manhattan square foot by square foot. 3 years, he said, as if reading a warranty. You've had your fun playing house with my son. David is my husband, I answered. David, he corrected softly, is my heir. You are a distraction. He opened a drawer and produced a check, already filled out, already signed. $2 million, made out to me. The zeros shook for a second before the number settled into my reality. Sign the divorce papers, he said. Take the money, disappear. David will get over you. He loves me. He laughed, an actual sound like crystal cracking. Love is temporary. Legacy is forever. Consider this a generous severance package. Something in me tightened. Not at the number, but at the way he spoke about his son as a business unit and me as line item waste. I could feel the polished floor tilt under us, but his balance never wavered. He watched me with tranquil contempt, the way you might watch a stray dog calculate whether to run or beg. And if I say no? His eyes didn't change. Then things become difficult for you, for your family back in Ohio. He let the next line fall like a coin in a cathedral. Your mother's nursing home is expensive, isn't it? $6,000 a month. Alzheimer's had been unspooling her sentences thread by thread. We kept her warm, fed, safe. How did he... You looked into my family, I said. I look into anything that threatens what's mine. Leather creaked as he leaned back. This check clears today. The offer expires at midnight. The check was heavy in my hand, as if ink could acquire mass. I studied the signature, the account line, numbers I didn't intend to forget. I need time to think, I said. You have 8 hours. I walked out with 2 new weights, the check in my purse and a seed of dread I could feel taking root. The elevator walls reflected a woman who looked like she didn't belong to this building's geometry. Teachers from Ohio weren't designed for mahogany ultimatums, but teachers know systems, and systems leave patterns if you look long enough. That night I told David about the offer. He paced a track into our living room rug, hands in his hair, cursing his father by full name. When I said the number, 2 million, something, and I hate that I noticed, stuttered across his face. That's oddly specific, he said. Why that number? I watched him bite the inside of his cheek, an old tell. What? I asked. It's the exact amount of his quarterly charity write-offs, David said quietly. I've helped sign some of the packets. It's like clockwork. The room changed temperature. Charity, clockwork, 2 million. Show me, I said. We pulled files onto the kitchen table, a hurricane of paper. Donation letters, tax schedules, smiling press photos with novelty checks. The organizations had names built like clean glass: Riverside Children's Foundation, Metropolitan Arts Initiative, Urban Development Trust. We traced addresses to empty lots, phone numbers to the snow of disconnected lines, EINs that belonged to no one. The ledger entries paired neatly with a man who believed legacy was the only permanent thing on earth. Around midnight, I realized I was whispering. If you've ever lowered your voice in your own home, you already know what fear does. It moves the walls closer. This isn't small, I said. This is a machine. David nodded, a man trying to separate the father from the facts. I watched him reach for the pieces of his childhood and come away with splinters. He wanted to be angry at his father. The greater horror was discovering his father had accounted for that too. We kept looking. The write-offs ran back years. The pattern was anesthetizing in its precision. Money out, reputation up, questions dead on arrival. When David finally spoke, it was to name a door neither of us had opened. There's more. There always is. Like what? I asked. Records you wouldn't keep here. My father keeps a separate archive. He calls it legacy material. He swallowed. I've only heard him mention it once. He was furious with his accountant for mislabeling a box. Where? He hesitated, then pressed his palms to the wood as if bracing for impact. His desk, bottom drawer. He tapes things underneath, keys, codes. I stared at him. You think there's a storage unit. I think if my father invented the idea of permanence, he'd want his paper trail to feel eternal. I touched his wrist. If we look, we don't look alone. He covered my hand with his, and in the silence I felt what had always been true between us. Love as a stubborn fact, not a performance. The problem with love, his father would say, is that it makes people sentimental. The power of love, I thought, is that it makes people brave. Before we left, we argued about the check. It lay between us, like an insult we hadn't finished answering. Take it, David said suddenly. I blinked. Excuse me? Take the check, he repeated. If his people are watching, and they are, it tells them you're doing what he wants. It buys us time. My father respects appearances more than truth. I didn't want to hear the next sentence, but he gave it anyway. He's already threatened your mom. The words felt like a hand on the back of my neck, pushing me toward the only door. I picked up the check and slid it into my purse. The zipper sounded like a decision. We drove downtown to his office after midnight, when buildings pretend to sleep. David's keycard stuttered green. In the lamplight of a corner conference room, he pulled out his father's desk drawer, flipped it, and ran his fingers along the underside. Tape. Cold metal. A small silver key. No label, of course. We looked at each other, and in the window glass, I saw two people who hadn't gone looking for a war and were suddenly standing in its foyer. If there's a unit, I said, it won't be in his name. It'll be nested in some shell, he agreed. But my father reuses patterns even when he thinks he's changing them. Legacy is forever, I said, and we both heard what he hadn't meant to admit. Things that pretend to last also leave the longest shadows. David found the shell company in 30 minutes because here's the secret about men who think they're gods. They're repeatable. The name was mildly grand and freshly forgettable. The address tied to a storage facility across town. Now? David asked. Now, I said, though my hands were shaking. The unit door rattled up like a breath held too long. Inside, boxes. Rows and rows. Old banker cartons with handwriting from 4 different lifetimes. The air smelled like paper, ink, and dust. Human time measured in files. David flicked on his phone's flashlight. The beam hit a label on the nearest box. Acquisitions, 1943. Sometimes you open a door and the past steps through wearing boots. I lifted the lid and the first page made my mouth go dry. A purchase agreement for a restaurant sold for $500. Paper clipped to it, a yellowed newspaper clipping about a man with the same surname found floating in the Hudson a month later. David whispered, "Oh God." Behind us, metal shrieked. The roll-up gate slid closed on its own, or not on its own. I turned. A silhouette filled the entrance, backlit by the low sun leaking under the warehouse roof. Calm, patient, as if he'd come to watch a favorite scene. "I was wondering when you'd find this place," my father-in-law said. He stepped inside, and the door thudded shut, a soft, civilized sound for something that could end a life. "You could have taken the money and spared yourself this education," he said, almost kindly. "But here we are." I thought of my mother's IV line, the nurse's hands, the quiet monitor. I thought of David as a boy, trusting the man in the portrait. "David doesn't know," I said. "David knows what he needs to know." He slipped a phone from his pocket. A paused security clip filled the screen. A nursing home hallway, a man in scrubs leaning into a room I knew too well. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You'll take the money and disappear tonight." "And if I don't?" He smiled with his eyes, not his mouth. Car accidents happen all the time, especially when people start asking inconvenient questions. Something inside me went cold and clear. "Fine," I said. "I'll take the money." Relief flickered across his face, an investor watching a risky position resolve. "1 hour," he said, "to say goodbye. If you tell David anything, your mother dies tonight." I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I had just decided what the $2 million would really buy us. Time. I used the hour he granted me like a blade. Carefully, at angles he wouldn't anticipate. I drove to David's office, called from the parking garage where the reception always clipped, and told him I needed to see him alone. When he opened the door, his eyes went straight to my face, then to the purse where the check lay like a hostage. "I'm taking it," I said loudly, in case anyone was listening in the hallway. "I'll text you where to send my things." His jaw worked, grief and fury warring. I shut the door, turned the blinds, and only then let the truth into the room in lower tones. "He has a camera on Mom's floor. He showed me a clip. He wants me gone tonight." David sat down without meaning to. He looks small in a chair built to make men look important. We can go to the police. Not yet, I said. He expects that move and he has people. We need to know what we have, what he has, and how to stay alive long enough to use it. We pulled out the files again. The charitable giving packets that had seemed performative now read like choreography. I wrote down every organization he'd donated to and started cross-referencing in the IRS database while David hunted city records. The names held together like drywall until your finger pressed. Then they crumbled. Riverside Children's Foundation had a P.O. box that had never received a single parcel. Metropolitan Arts Initiative listed a number that yielded the long beep of a telephone left to die. Urban Development Trust had an office suite that turned out to be an empty room smelling faintly of paint and nothing else. The EINs lived in a narrow band of digits, too neat, too proximate, like someone had minted a dozen identities in one afternoon and called it a community. Look at the timing, David said, laying out quarterly statements in 4 straight columns, a designer still chasing symmetry in the wreckage. $2 million at the end of each quarter, cash, then deductions claimed within a week. No acknowledgments filed by the charities, no public programs, no staff. Money goes out, I said, tapping the ledger. Reputation goes up, scrutiny goes nowhere. He rubbed his forehead. And if you take $2 million now, he gets to account for it in a story he understands. An inconvenient spouse paid and removed. The line item becomes clean. What he doesn't get, I replied, is why I took it. We stopped speaking in full sentences for a while. The room filled with paper and the soft metallic clicks of binder rings opening and closing. Once, I caught David's expression fracturing, the fault line running right through his loyalty. I put my hand on the page between us, and he steadied like a level finding true. Where would he keep the real records, I asked. Not the philanthropy theater, the spine. Somewhere off-grid, but under control, he said. He hates trusting outsiders. He also hates trusting his own memory. His desk, I said, bottom drawer. David's mouth twitched, not a smile. Recognition. He tapes things under there. I've seen him do it, as a kid, once. We moved like people crossing a river on stones. He went first, then texted me a photo of an empty hallway and 2 green-lit cameras angled away, the kind of trick only an architect who's had to stage walkthroughs could pull off convincingly. I followed 10 minutes later with a shopping bag and a harried expression, the performance of a woman about to cash out of her life. In the office, the mahogany was still a continent. The portraits still watched like botanists studying an invasive species. David closed the door, exhaled, and mouthed, "Now." He pulled the bottom drawer, flipped it in his hands, and ran his fingers along the underside, patient as a safe cracker. Tape, a flat press of metal. He pried, and a small silver key came loose into his palm with the relief of a snagged fish unhooking. "There," he said, and for a second he was a boy who'd found his father's secret not to betray him, but to protect the house from burning. He reached under again and peeled up a second strip of tape. This time there was paper, a folded rectangle no bigger than a receipt. He opened it on the desk. A suite number, a facility name I didn't recognize. A shell company with a generous name that meant nothing if you weren't looking for its emptiness. Legacy Holdings LLC, I read. Subtle. He huffed, humorless. He thinks that's restraint. I took photos of the slip and the key on my phone, then texted the images to an email address I'd created years ago when I still believed secret addresses were for poetry drafts. Insurance, even then, had been a habit I didn't know would save my life. "Listen," David said after a beat. "If he's already threatened your mom, he'll expect you to take the money and vanish. That means he's watching for motion, not depth. We need to create the motion he expects and use the depth he's forgotten we have." I knew what he meant. A decoy that looked like my future packed up in a hurry, the visible arc of a woman abandoning a marriage for liquid security. Hotel room, luggage, a reservation flung into the world with all the subtlety of panic. Meanwhile, the actual work would happen in the places where narrative didn't apply. Servers, back rooms, the quiet grammar of numbers. We talked in arrangements, not romance. He would fetch building access codes from a contractor friend who'd never ask questions if a job smelled like money. I would book a hotel under my maiden name and make sure the cameras got a clear profile of me crying into room service napkins. He would photograph everything in the unit, not just the old acquisitions, but the current operations, if they existed, and we both knew they did. I would start building an archive like a cathedral, redundant, resilient, airy, with hidden buttresses, so that if any wall fell, the rest would stand. Before we split, David took my face in his hands. If he corners you again, you say yes to anything he asks. The truth will exist somewhere else. That's not how I'm built, I said. It is, he replied, when your mother is the cost of a refusal. I hated him for the correctness and loved him for telling me anyway. We left through separate doors. In the elevator, I practiced a look I'd seen his father wear, cool boredom, and failed. In the lobby, I let my shoulders drop like I'd dropped a life. Outside, I made a phone call that I didn't need to make and cried where a security camera could see it. Motion, not depth. Let him track the wrong currency. Back in my car, I opened the photo again. The key in David's palm, the paper slip with the company name, the storage facility address printed in Banal Sans Serif. I memorized the suite number as if I'd grown up there, as if the door had ever swung for me. When I looked up, a black SUV idled across the street, same make that had shadowed me for weeks. A man in sunglasses checked his watch. He wasn't watching the building. He was watching me. I put the car in gear and drove to the hotel I'd already booked. I tipped too much. I asked for extra hangers like I intended to stay a while. On my way up in the elevator, I texted David one word and an emoji we'd never used for anything but theater. Curtain. Across town, he texted back a suite number and a single sentence that made my skin prickle. Door recognized the key. The air inside the storage unit was heavy with dust, like the room itself had been holding its breath for 70 years. David's flashlight sliced across cardboard boxes stacked to the ceiling, each one labeled in a tidy, slanted handwriting that didn't belong to any accountant I'd ever met. The first box read, Acquisitions 1943. The next, Client Files 1962. Then, Operations 1987. Decades of history, arranged like a timeline of crimes disguised as progress. David ran his hand over the nearest lid. He kept everything, he whispered. His voice was equal parts awe and nausea. He's been building this archive since before either of us were born. We knelt and opened the first box. Inside were thin folders tied with string, brittle paper browned with age. A purchase contract for an Italian restaurant sold for $500. Paper clipped to it was a newspaper clipping about the owner's accidental drowning. A note scrawled in the margin read, Transfer complete. Risk eliminated. I felt my stomach twist. He bought properties from dead men, I said softly. He made his fortune from ghosts. David turned the next folder. Another signature, another obituary. This one ended with the phrase, Family fled town after threats. The pattern was meticulous. Threat, forced sale, death. And every death brought another building under the Ashworth name. The deeper we went, the colder the air felt, as if the past itself wanted to stay buried. The 1960s boxes introduced typed memos and carbon copies, correspondence with the Luce's crime family, financial statements divided by percentage splits, 70% Ashworth operations, 30% external partners. The phrase territorial adjustments appeared often, next to names crossed out with clean, deliberate strokes. By the 1980s files, the tone had shifted from intimidation to corporate precision. Typed psychological profiles replaced handwritten notes. Some had family photos stapled to them, small faces smiling from behind paper clips. Look at this, David said, pulling one free. Vincent Castellano, grocery store owner, wife pregnant, eldest daughter engaged. They knew everything about these people. Every folder had an annotation in the margin. Risk level, leverage points, recommended persuasion methods. It read like military intelligence, not business. Some of the notes were stamped resolved. Others, escalated. The ones marked resolved almost always had newspaper clippings attached. Accidents, fires, disappearances. I whispered, Your great-grandfather didn't build anything. He conquered it. David's hands trembled as he opened another folder. And he kept records of every conquest. He flipped pages, contracts, insurance claims, death certificates. He treated murder like accounting. One box in the back was newer, its cardboard crisp and its label written in his father's unmistakable handwriting, Family Management. David hesitated before pulling it open. Inside were folders labeled with names he recognized: his uncle, his cousins, his mother. And near the bottom, one marked David Ashworth, Subject Evaluation. He stared at it for a long moment, as if touching it would confirm something irreversible. Then he opened it. Every line made my blood run colder. Transcripts of conversations they'd had years ago, summaries of phone calls, even analysis of his college essays. Subject demonstrates curiosity regarding corporate structure, one paragraph read. Potential liability if exposed to sensitive information. Recommend career redirection toward design to minimize exposure. He flipped another page. They planned my life, he whispered. Every choice I made, school, work, it was all designed to keep me blind. Then he found another file, my name. Lila Merrick, Threat Assessment. My hands shook as I took it. Inside, the pages described my background in chilling detail. Above average intelligence, ethical tendencies, persistent personality, potential whistleblower. At the bottom, in bold type, recommended management, surveillance, leverage through maternal care, termination protocol if exposure risk escalates. David looked up, horror widening his eyes. He planned your elimination, he said. He wrote it down. My voice barely came out. And my mother's. The final box sat in the corner, unmarked. I pulled it closer, my palms leaving smudges in the dust. When I lifted the lid, the smell of mold and something chemical hit me. Inside were digital drives and folders labeled Current Operations. The contents were worse than anything in the past boxes. Lists of construction companies used to traffic workers, offshore accounts used for arms deals, even a section titled Community Reclamation Projects, a euphemism for forced evictions and disappearances. This isn't history, I said. It's still happening. David's flashlight flickered, and for a second the room went dark. In the half-light, I felt the world narrow to our breathing. When the beam steadied again, I noticed the faint shadow under the door, movement. He turned off the light, mouthing, "Someone's here." Footsteps, slow, intentional. Then the metallic groan of the rolling door. A strip of orange light widened across the concrete floor, stretching until it illuminated a familiar silhouette. His father stepped inside, the last daylight framing him like a halo twisted into something unholy. Gone was the boardroom calm. This version of him wore no mask. His voice was smooth, deliberate. "I was wondering when you'd find this place." My throat tightened. David froze beside me. "You could have taken the money," he continued, stepping closer, the door clanging shut behind him. "Could have spared yourself the education you clearly didn't want." "Education?" I spat. "You call this an education?" He looked around the boxes, almost fond. "History, my dear. My father built foundations. I build legacies." "You built an empire on blood," David said, his voice shaking. "You murdered Mom for finding out." His father smiled, calm as a priest at confession. "Car accidents happen every day, especially when people start asking inconvenient questions." I felt David's breath hitch beside me. For a heartbeat, I thought he'd lunge at him. But the man in front of us wasn't built to lose control. He'd already calculated the odds. "You'll take the money," he said to me, voice low and steady, "and disappear tonight." "And if I don't?" I asked. He raised his phone, the glow of the screen lighting his face from below. Footage from the nursing home flickered. My mother's IV line, a man in scrubs adjusting the drip. My blood ran cold. I protect my family's legacy," he said softly, "by any means necessary, even from my own son." "You killed your wife," I whispered. "You'd kill anyone." He smiled faintly. "Everyone dies for something. Yours might as well be for love." He turned to leave, confident the threat had landed, but as his footsteps echoed out of the unit, David whispered, "We're not running." I looked at the key still clutched in his hand, the boxes around us, the evidence stacked higher than fear. Then we fight smart. That night, we didn't sleep. We made copies, digital, encrypted, sent to secure servers, to journalists David still trusted from college. And one copy went to a person who owed me a favor, my old roommate, now working quietly at the IRS. We didn't need revenge. We needed exposure. The next day, the news would call it the Ashworth Revelation. But that night, we called it survival. I didn't remember sleeping. When dawn finally touched the edges of the blinds, it felt like the city had aged overnight. The air tasted of adrenaline and printer ink. David sat at the dining table, eyes red from hours of scanning and uploading. Every box file had been photographed, every document backed up, each set of photos renamed and hidden inside encrypted folders across multiple cloud drives. "We have 3 copies," he said, voice hoarse. "One with your friend at the IRS, one in a secure drive that auto-releases if we don't log in every 48 hours, and one buried so deep even I had to write down the path." "Then we're safe?" I asked, knowing the answer. He shook his head. "Not yet. He still controls the narrative." That was what it came down to, the story. The Ashworths didn't just own buildings. They owned the story about those buildings. And whoever owned the story controlled what the world believed. That was why my silence was worth $2 million. We spent the morning designing a lie that would keep us alive long enough to tell the truth. David would stay visible, business as usual, the loyal son who regretted a failed marriage. I would play the part of the wife cashing out, exactly the performance his father needed to see. At noon, I checked into a hotel under my maiden name. I dragged 2 suitcases behind me and made sure the security cameras caught every angle. In the elevator mirror, I practiced looking broken. The bellhop offered to help. I told him I just needed quiet. He nodded the way people do when they're afraid of fragile things. Once inside the room, I ordered room service I wouldn't eat, turned on the TV for noise, and began staging my disappearance. Half-packed bags, open laptop, crumpled tissues in the trash. I even left a draft email to David titled, "I'm sorry." When I stepped back, it looked like a nervous breakdown captured mid-scene. Perfect. While I played Ghost, David played Insider. He drove to the storage facility through a maintenance corridor his contractor friend had unlocked, one that bypassed the front desk cameras. For 2 hours, he photographed everything I hadn't, scanning financial ledgers and USB drives, labeling boxes by decade. Each photo went straight to a live sync folder that updated on my screen in real time. Watching it felt like listening to a heart monitor for evidence instead of life. The last file he sent made me shiver. A type sheet titled Elimination Protocol, Subject Merrick. Beneath it, a checklist. 1. Medication error. 2. Emotional destabilization. 3. Controlled accident, preferred bridge or car. I stared until the text blurred. That was the moment I stopped being afraid. Fear had rules. Rage didn't. By the time David returned, we had more than enough to end the empire, but we still needed an audience that couldn't be silenced. My old roommate connected us with a quiet contact at the State Attorney General's office, someone who'd handled public corruption cases. We built an email chain linking every piece of proof, then set it to auto-send to her, to 3 national newspapers, and to the FBI if either of our phones went dark for more than 48 hours. Insurance on top of insurance. At 7 that night, David's father called my cell. The display showed unknown. When I answered, his tone was pure civility. "Are you ready to sign the divorce papers?" "Yes," I said, "but I want to see David first." Silence, then a sigh. "You have 1 hour. If you tell him anything, your mother dies tonight." The line went dead. I looked at the clock, then at David. He gave me 60 minutes. Then we make them count. We met at his office again. Safe ground only because we'd already checked for listening devices. I walked in loud, shouting about betrayal for any cameras watching, then shut the door behind me and dropped the act. "He's expecting me to vanish," I said. "We need to get this into official hands tonight." David nodded, sliding a flash drive across the desk. "Everything's here, but we can't walk into the main FBI building. He's had friends there for years. We go public corruption, different jurisdiction." We chose a route no one could trace. Drive separately to the FBI's downtown field office, hand the evidence in person, and demand witness protection under federal whistleblower law. Simple in theory, suicidal in practice. Before we left, I grabbed David's hand. "If we get separated, go to the press. Don't stop." He pressed the flash drive into my palm. "You go to the FBI. I'll follow 5 minutes behind." The streetlights smeared against the windshield as I drove. Every pair of headlights in the mirror felt like a tail. When I finally saw the federal building, my pulse eased, until I noticed the sign, "Closed for emergency maintenance. All appointments relocated." That didn't make sense. Federal buildings don't close for maintenance. I called David immediately. "Something's wrong. There's a temporary office across town, industrial district." His voice went sharp. "Don't go inside until I get there." But curiosity, or maybe desperation, drove me closer. The so-called temporary office was a low brick building with tinted windows and a parking lot too empty for government work. As I pulled in, two men in suits stepped from the doorway. Their watches gleamed gold in the sodium light. "Can we help you, ma'am?" one asked, smiling without warmth. "I'm here to speak with Agent Torres," I said carefully. "Agent Torres isn't available," the other replied. "You'll need to schedule an appointment." Behind them I could see through the glass. No cubicles, no desks, just bare walls. I smiled politely. "Of course, I'll come back tomorrow." When I turned, my reflection caught the dark SUV parked across the street, the same one that had followed me before. I walked to my car as calmly as I could. Inside, my hands were trembling too hard to start the engine. They'd gotten here first. David arrived minutes later, parking 2 rows over. He didn't even need to speak. The look in his eyes said it all. We weren't meeting the FBI. We were walking into a trap. "They know," I whispered. "They're everywhere," he said. "The system's compromised." For a moment, the weight of it crushed us. Every institution we'd been taught to trust, now an extension of his father's reach. But despair is a luxury for people who still have time. We didn't. "There's one person left," David said suddenly. "Trevor Martinelli, college friend. He works for the state attorney general. If anyone can escalate this outside federal hands, it's him." We drove straight to a public library, the last place anyone still uses computers they don't own. Under flickering fluorescent light, we logged into separate terminals and sent Trevor everything: photos, ledgers, blackmail files, even the plan for my death. Then we waited, watching the screen like it could breathe. 40 minutes later, the reply came. Subject. Got it. Body. "This is insane. I'm already on the phone with the Attorney General. Do not go home. I'm pulling a team." I exhaled for the first time in hours. David leaned back, exhaustion painting shadows under his eyes. "We did it," he murmured. But I wasn't sure, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I still heard his father's voice. Smooth, certain, eternal. Legacy is forever. And I had the feeling he wasn't finished yet. We didn't wait for dawn. Trevor's next message came at 2:14 a.m. State Task Force activated. Local FBI compromised. Get out of NYC. Go north. Text when secure. No hesitation. No questions. We packed what little we'd kept. 2 laptops, burner phones, flash drives, and the $2 million check that had started everything. I slipped it into my jacket pocket like a trophy from a war we hadn't survived yet. The highway out of Manhattan was almost empty. The skyline behind us looked like a confession burning in glass. David drove in silence until the lights disappeared, then said quietly, "You think they'll come after us?" "They already have," I answered. "But this time we're not alone." By sunrise, we reached a state police barracks 2 hours north. Trevor had arranged everything. The sergeant on duty knew our names, but not our story, only that we were witnesses in a sensitive corruption case. He led us to a converted holding cell with 2 cots and a humming space heater. The walls smelled like bleach and safety. For the first time in 48 hours, I slept. When I woke, David was staring at his phone. "Trevor's update," he said. "They're surveilling the storage unit instead of raiding it. They want to see who else shows up." It didn't take long. Within a single day, cameras recorded visits from people whose names belonged on plaques, not police reports. A federal judge, 2 city council members, a police captain, the owner of the largest construction firm in Manhattan. Each arrived separately, stayed only minutes, and left with small briefcases or padded envelopes. "They're cleaning up," David said bitterly. "They're confirming everything," I corrected. Trevor's next call was hushed but electric. "We've traced the storage facility ownership. It's a shell inside a shell, registered under Empire Logistics LLC, a company your father founded in 1994. He's been using it as a drop point for bribes, blackmail material, and physical evidence of every transaction." I could hear papers rustling through the receiver. "Lila, listen to this," Trevor said. "One unit's filled with stolen artwork and jewelry. Another holds falsified immigration papers. There's even one with unregistered firearms." He paused. "Your father-in-law isn't just laundering money. He's running a black market that touches every major city on the East Coast." David pressed his hand to his forehead. "God." Trevor's voice dropped to a whisper. "The task force moves tomorrow morning. Multiple raids coordinated at once. Stay put until I call." We hung up, and for a long time, the only sound was the heater clicking. Then David spoke. Do you think he knows we're the ones who exposed him? He knows, I said, but right now he's too busy saving himself to kill us. Morning came gray and still. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft flakes dissolving against the cruiser windshields. The sergeant handed us coffee so strong it tasted like courage. They'll call soon, he said. At 9:37 a.m., Trevor's voice returned, tight with adrenaline. They're in. Storage facility, corporate office, the private club, his home, everything hit at once. David and I crowded around the small TV mounted in the corner of the barracks. The news channels cut from one live feed to another. Agents swarming the glass tower downtown. Evidence boxes loaded into vans. Luxury cars impounded on Fifth Avenue. Then came the image that stopped both of us. His father, handcuffed in a navy suit, led down marble steps while cameras flashed like gunfire. The anchor's voice trembled with excitement. Breaking news. Multi-agency raids in connection with one of the largest organized crime investigations in state history. For a moment, David couldn't breathe. I watched tears carve lines through the exhaustion on his face. He can't talk his way out this time, he whispered, not with cameras watching. But victory wasn't clean. Trevor called again that night, his tone more measured. We've arrested 47 people so far, but it's bigger than we thought. The files show links to similar shell companies in Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago. We'll be chasing this for years. David leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. 70 years of crimes, he murmured. 3 generations. How many people did they hurt? Hundreds, Trevor said quietly. Possibly more. After we hung up, I sat beside David on the cot. You did it, I said. You broke the chain. He shook his head. No, we just stopped being part of it. That night, he couldn't sleep. Neither could I. Every creak of the building made us flinch. When he finally spoke, it was almost a confession. You know, I used to think my father was unstoppable. Now I realize he was just protected by silence. That's what power really is, noise drowning out the truth. I reached for his hand. Then we make noise. The next morning, the raids continued. The names scrolling across the news ticker read like an obituary for corruption. Judges, councilmen, developers. Each arrest led to another. Each confession linked to another city. The Attorney General called it a network of influence woven into the fabric of real estate and politics. 2 days later, the knock came. A federal agent, real this time, stood at the door of our barracks room. You're being moved, she said. Protective custody until the trials begin. We followed her outside into the cold morning. Snow covered the parking lot, blurring tire tracks. Behind us, the radio inside the station still played the news. 70-year criminal enterprise exposed. I looked at David. His shoulders sagged, but his eyes, his mother's eyes, held something new. Not triumph, not relief, just the beginning of understanding what it means to survive the truth. We climbed into the unmarked car. The door closed with a sound that felt final. As the vehicle pulled onto the highway, I reached into my coat pocket and touched the folded check. The paper was soft now, edges worn. $2 million for silence. I smiled faintly. He was right about one thing, I said. Legacy is forever, just not the way he meant it. The trials began 6 months later, under skies the color of concrete. The courthouse was surrounded by cameras, barricades, and a storm of voices. Reporters shouting, victims' families holding faded photographs, former business partners pretending they'd never known the Ashworth name. David and I sat on the witness bench, silent, waiting for the machinery of justice to turn. When his father entered, chained but upright, the room fell into a hush so deep I could hear the click of handcuffs against metal. He still carried that eerie calm, the kind that comes from decades of getting away with it. The prosecution opened with evidence from the storage unit. One photograph after another projected across the courtroom. Falsified deeds, bank transfers, memos authorizing tenant persuasion, death certificates filed under false pretenses. Every paper we had touched now shone under sterile light. The defense objected, of course. They claimed forgery, conspiracy. A smear campaign by a vengeful ex-daughter-in-law, the attorney said, pointing at me like a weapon. I met his gaze, unflinching. He could smear my name all he wanted. He couldn't rewrite 70 years of signatures. When it was David's turn to testify, he walked to the stand like a man approaching his own ghost. He described the manipulation, the career path engineered, the financials he'd been allowed to see, the walls built around his curiosity. His voice broke when he mentioned his mother. The prosecutor handed him a file. "Mr. Ashworth, do you recognize this document?" David's fingers shook. "Yes," he whispered. "It's my mother's file, the one labeled Margaret Ashworth, Problem Resolution." He read the line aloud. "Subject eliminated following discovery of unauthorized document review. Accident staged successfully." The courtroom froze. Even the defense attorney looked momentarily human. David's father showed no reaction. He just adjusted his cufflinks as if tidying a meeting note. That small gesture made David's voice rise, sharp and raw. "She was your wife," he shouted. "You murdered her because she asked questions." The judge banged the gavel for order, but the silence afterward carried more power than the sound. When my turn came, the prosecutor guided me gently. I described the meeting in the mahogany office, the $2 million check, the threat against my mother. I played the recording, one we'd captured the night before the raids. His voice filled the room, smooth and certain. "You'll take the money and disappear tonight." No one spoke. The jury stared at him like he'd finally been caught breathing underwater. The weeks that followed were a blur of witnesses and evidence. The accountant flipped first, then the construction magnate, then two of the city council members. Each confession confirmed another piece of the puzzle: bribes, coercion, intimidation, all of it woven into the city's growth like rot under marble. When the verdict came, it rolled through the room like a quiet thunder, guilty on all counts. David's father stood slowly. He didn't plead. He didn't apologize. He simply turned to me and said, almost kindly, "You destroyed everything." I met his eyes. "No," I said. "I exposed what you'd already destroyed." The judge sentenced him to life in prison without parole. He would die behind bars, surrounded by the paper ghosts of every deal he'd ever made. The aftermath stretched into months. Trials for associates, civil suits from families, endless interviews with investigators and journalists. The Ashworth empire collapsed piece by piece, buildings seized, accounts frozen, portraits of stern men pulled from mahogany walls. But justice wasn't simple math. Some losses couldn't be repaid. During one civil hearing, an elderly woman named Rosa Moretti took the stand. Her voice trembled as she spoke of her father, who'd sold their restaurant for $500 in 1943 after men in suits threatened him. She'd been 10. She remembered hiding under the counter while her father begged. "I spent 80 years wondering what happened," she said, tears shining in her eyes. "Now I finally know." When the judge awarded damages to her family, Rosa just nodded. "No amount of money brings my papa back," she said softly. "But now, at least, people will remember his name." David squeezed my hand so hard my bones ached. Neither of us could speak. By the end of that year, over 100 convictions had been handed down. More were pending. News outlets called it the largest organized crime exposure in New York real estate history. But in quieter corners, we were still paying. David woke from nightmares of his mother's voice calling through fire. I couldn't walk past a nursing home without hearing the hum of IV pumps. Justice had come, but peace lagged behind. We started therapy together. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a psychologist who specialized in families of criminals, met us twice a week. "Guilt is stubborn," she told David. "You were trained to serve a man who built his power on manipulation. Breaking free doesn't erase that programming overnight." Sometimes in sessions, David would whisper, "I signed documents. What if I helped him hurt people?" Dr. Chen would answer gently, "Intent matters. You acted under deception, not malice. The fact that you chose truth when it endangered you, that's the measure of your soul." Gradually, he started breathing again. So did I. The trials continued around us, waves of consequence rippling outward. Former mayors, bank executives, judges. The city was cleaning itself, one name at a time. But at night, when the world went quiet, I'd still dream of the storage unit, the dust, the smell of old paper and gasoline, and his voice echoing from the dark. Legacy is forever. Sometimes I woke with an answer ready on my tongue. "Yes," I'd whisper into the dark. But so is truth. 3 years passed before the world felt like it could exhale again. The city moved on. Skyscrapers rose. Newspapers found new scandals. But for the families of the victims, time had a different rhythm. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live in a world that finally knew. David and I bought a small house 2 hours north near the lake where his mother used to take him as a boy. It wasn't wealth, it was quiet. The kind of quiet you could trust. The $2 million check still sat in an FBI evidence locker, yellowed and creased. Every time the agents asked if we wanted it back, I told them the same thing. Keep it. It's proof that some offers cost more than they're worth. David left real estate behind entirely. He went back to school, earned his certification, and now teaches architecture at a local high school. He builds model houses with his students, tiny, perfect things made of cardboard and glue, and tells them what his father never told him: build things that last for the right reasons. Sometimes I visit his class. The students love hearing how buildings have hearts if people give them one. They ask about our past in whispers, like touching a scar. David answers honestly, "My father built an empire out of fear. I'm trying to build something out of honesty." I still teach elementary school, but on weekends I volunteer with immigrant advocacy groups, families trying to keep their homes, their shops, their safety. When they ask why I'm so passionate about property law, I smile and say, because I've seen what happens when people lose everything to someone else's greed. One afternoon, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a letter written in a careful, looping script. My grandmother, Rosa Moretti, passed peacefully last month. Before she died, she asked me to thank you and David. Knowing the truth gave her peace she'd waited 80 years for. Enclosed is a photograph of my great-grandfather's restaurant, taken before it was sold. She said she wanted you to have it. The photo showed a family of 6 standing proudly in front of a small Italian cafe. Sunlight caught the sign above the door, Moretti's Trattoria. In their faces, I could see the shape of every family that had been stolen from. I framed the photo and hung it in our kitchen, between our wedding picture and David's teaching certificate. It wasn't decor. It was reminder and memorial all at once. Each spring, we drive into the city for the memorial service. The site where the storage facility once stood is now a community center surrounded by affordable housing. The memorial wall inside bears 600 names etched in black granite. Children trace the letters with their fingers while parents whisper stories that begin with, "They never got justice back then, but they do now." At last year's service, Rosa's great-granddaughter, just 7 years old, placed a white lily at the base of the wall. Her voice was small but clear. "This is for my great-great-grandfather, Antonio Moretti." Then she began to read other names aloud: Giuseppe Fontana, Vincent Castellano, Margaret Ashworth. David stood beside me, tears sliding down his face. "That's my mother," he said softly. "They're saying her name." When it was our turn to speak, David told the crowd, "Some legacies are worth protecting. Others are worth destroying. My father's empire stood on fear. These names," he gestured to the wall, "stand on truth." I spoke next. I told them about the night in that office, the check, the threat, the moment fear turned into resolve. "Justice can take decades, Faye," I said, "but truth has a long memory. It finds its way home." After the ceremony, we walked the perimeter of the wall. At the edge stood a plaque dedicating the community center to those who refuse to be silent. David touched the engraving with his fingertips, and I realized the tremor in his hands was gone. 2 months later, news came that his father had died in prison, a heart attack at 69. David didn't go to the funeral. Instead, we returned to the memorial. We read the names again, one by one, until the sun set and the granite caught the light like water. On the drive home, he said quietly, "I used to think his legacy would haunt me forever." "And now?" I asked. "Now I see it was never mine to carry," he said. "We built our own." At home, the lake reflected the first stars. The night was still, the air clean. I stood by the kitchen window, looking at the framed photograph, the Moretti family frozen in sunlight, unaware that their story would someday find its ending. People sometimes ask if we regret it, the money, the comfort, the easy life we could have had. I tell them no, because peace is the rarest kind of wealth, and truth is the only inheritance worth keeping. Every morning when I wake, I see that photograph and whisper the same promise: we remembered you. And for the first time in generations, the legacy that endures isn't one of silence or fear, it's one of justice.